It was midnight when I walked out to my car to grab the jacket I'd left on the back seat. Diane was already sitting in the passenger seat. She was 58 years old, my ex-wife's mother, a woman who showed up to every holiday with something she'd baked from scratch, who called me occasionally even after the divorce just to check in. She was not the kind of person you expected to find in your car at midnight. I stood at the driver's side door, looking in through the glass for long enough that my breath started to fog it. Diane looked back at me with the expression of someone who had already worked out this conversation in her head and was prepared to wait for me to catch up to the pace she'd set. "Just drive, Owen," she said, loud enough that I could hear her through the door. "I'll explain on the way." And the thing is, I got in. I started the car. Because whatever tone a person uses when they mean to cause trouble, Diane wasn't using it. That was the voice of someone who had been holding something for too long and had finally decided tonight was the night they were going to let it go. My name is Owen Garrett. I'm 31 years old, and I'm a mechanical engineer at a consulting firm in Indianapolis, Indiana. The kind of work that involves a lot of load calculations, structural reviews, site assessments, and meetings with people who use the phrase "going forward" more than any phrase deserves to be used. It's steady, and it's honest, and I'm good at it, which is about as much as I've ever needed from a job. I grew up in a suburb of Indianapolis, went to Purdue for engineering, came back and found work locally without much drama about it. I live alone in a midtown apartment that's the right size for one person. Spare bedroom I haven't done anything useful with. A kitchen I actually use. A couch positioned for watching the TV that's slightly too big for the room. I watch too much football on weekends, keep a decent coffee routine, and go to the same Thai place every Thursday night because decision fatigue is real, and I made peace with that particular habit years ago. 14 months ago, I signed divorce papers ending a 3-year marriage to Rachel Garrett, née Calloway. Rachel is sharp and driven and restless in all the ways I am not, and for a while that worked. She pulled me out of my own head when I needed it. I gave her somewhere to land when she needed to slow down, and somewhere in the middle of all that, there was genuine love, the kind that's hard to question while you're inside it. But somewhere around year 2, the friction that had seemed like energy between us started feeling like something else, like two gears that didn't quite mesh, wearing each other down gradually rather than driving anything forward. There was no single moment where it broke. It just got quieter, and then it got separate. And then one afternoon we had a conversation in the kitchen that ended with her saying she thought we both already knew. She was right. I signed the papers and moved into the apartment, and 8 months after that, Rachel got married again. To someone named Kyle, who I know very little about, and who seemed like a perfectly decent person when I eventually ran into them. The strangest thing about the aftermath of a divorce is figuring out which relationships you've actually lost, and which ones, unexpectedly, survive. Rachel and I don't talk much, some texts around the holidays, a practical exchange when there was still a shared account to close out, that kind of thing. That makes sense. But Diane, her mother, kept calling. Not often, once every few weeks, usually short, usually nothing more substantial than her asking how work was going and me telling her, and then her saying something dry and funny about her own week before we wrapped up. She had a particular gift for making ordinary conversation feel like exactly the right amount of human contact, neither too much nor too little. I never asked her why she maintained the connection. I just accepted it, the way you accept the things that feel right even without a clear explanation for them. I think, looking back, that I kept those calls because Diane was the only person from that entire chapter of my life who talked to me like a person she actually knew rather than a person she was managing around the awkwardness of a divorce. She was just honest, and honest was what I needed more than I knew I did. I should say something about Vivian Park, because the whole story turns on her, and you need to know who she was to me before that midnight drive. Viv had been our neighbor for the better part of 2 years, while Rachel and I were still together. She was a graphic designer, freelance, quiet in a specific way that wasn't shyness, more like she was always paying attention to more than was immediately obvious, taking information in without making a production of the fact that she was receiving it. We talked over the back fence on mornings when we both happened to be outside. She came to the occasional dinner with Rachel's other friends, sat at the end of the table, and contributed to conversations when she had something specific to add, and said nothing in the long stretches when she didn't. She was in my life the way neighbors sometimes are, present and familiar without ever becoming something you'd describe as close, or so I thought at the time. I was, it turns out, not paying the kind of attention to Viv that Viv was apparently paying to me. When Rachel and I started separating, Viv pulled back. She stopped coming around, stopped being available for the casual gatherings that had mostly stopped happening anyway. I assumed she was keeping her distance out of loyalty, doing what people do when they're caught between two people who are falling apart, choosing a side or choosing to disappear. Viv, I assumed, had made her choice. By the time the divorce was final, I hadn't spoken to her in months. 7 months before the night Diane sat in my car, Viv moved to Portland. I found out secondhand, from Rachel, mentioned in passing. I didn't think much about it. There's a road atlas in my glove compartment. Paper, folded, the kind that nobody uses to navigate anywhere anymore now that every phone does it for you. My father gave it to me when I bought my first car, a gesture so practical and so entirely like him that I've kept it through 3 vehicles even though I haven't once opened it to figure out how to get somewhere. He died 6 years ago. A heart attack. Fast. The kind that doesn't give you much time to do anything about it before the opportunity has passed. The atlas stays in the car because taking it out would feel like a decision I'm not ready to make about that particular piece of the past. Diane picked it up the moment I got into the car that night. She reached straight for the glove compartment like she'd been planning exactly this, pulled the atlas out, and set it on her lap. "I need to show you something," she said. And we drove. To understand what Diane told me that night, you have to understand what she saw 2 years earlier. Something she'd held on to because the timing had never been right to say it out loud, and because keeping it had felt for a while like the responsible and decent thing to do. We were about 10 minutes down the road, moving through the quiet suburban edge of the city, streetlights pacing us at even intervals, when she started. She didn't begin with Viv. She began with Rachel, which caught me off guard. "Rachel loved you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. But Rachel never really saw you. She loved what she thought you could become, which is a different kind of love, and it has a different shelf life." I watched that for 2 years. I saw the gap between the Owen she was talking to and the Owen you actually were. I don't think she ever noticed the gap. I'm not sure she would have even if I'd pointed it out. I didn't say anything. I kept my eyes on the road, the highway lights doing their steady rhythm above us, the familiar suburban geography of a city I'd grown up in sliding past in the dark. "The person who saw you," she said, "was Viv." She opened the atlas on her lap then, smoothing it out with both hands the way you'd unfold something that had been closed too long. "2 years ago," she said, "Rachel asked Viv to grab something from your car. I don't remember what it was. Some errand, something left in the back seat. Viv went out to the car and sat in the driver's seat looking for whatever it was. She traced her finger over the map without pointing to anything specific. I was coming back from the garden. I could see through the car window. Viv had taken this out of the glove compartment. She held up the atlas. She had it open on the steering wheel, just looking at it, not reading it, not using it. Just looking. "Okay," I said. "And she was crying," Diane said. "Quietly. The kind of crying you do when you think no one can see you." I didn't respond to that right away. The road stretched out ahead of us, yellow streetlights spacing themselves evenly along the suburban edge of the city, the familiar geography of a place I'd spent my whole life in. "I don't know exactly what she was thinking," Diane continued, "but I've thought about it a lot since. A person doesn't sit alone in someone else's car, holding something that belonged to their father, and cry like that, unless she's feeling something significant about that person, something she knows she doesn't have the right to feel, and knows it, and feels it anyway." I let that sit for a minute. Then I said, "Why didn't you say something at the time?" "Because at the time, you were married to my daughter," she said simply. "And the feeling I watched Viv have, there was nothing I could do with it. So I logged it. The way you log things you can't use yet, but might matter later." That was Diane entirely, practical even about the parts of life that resist practicality. She kept going. She told me things I hadn't known, or more accurately, things I'd seen but hadn't labeled correctly. Viv's timing on mornings when we both happened to be in the backyard at the same time. Diane had noticed, from her own visits to the house over those 2 years, that Viv was consistently out there earlier on the days she knew I'd be home. That the overlap between her schedule and mine was less accidental than it looked from the inside. She had seen it and simply filed it as another piece of the picture she was building without any particular plan for what she'd do with it. The way Viv had always found a reason not to come over on evenings when Rachel was home, but I wasn't, even when Rachel specifically invited her. Busy with work, or just tired, or something vague that Rachel accepted without pressing. "I didn't think anything of it at the time," Diane said. "But patterns are patterns." The text message Viv sent me the day Rachel and I announced our separation, I knew about that one, because I'd received it. "I know," Viv had written, "you probably have your hands full. But if you ever need anyone to just talk to, I'm around." I had read it, decided it was the kind of courtesy text people sent in these situations because they felt they should say something, and replied with a brief thank you. I hadn't considered it further. What I hadn't known, and what Diane told me now, was that Viv had typed and deleted that message 3 times before sending it. She'd told Diane this herself, after the fact. And when I didn't respond in a way that suggested I'd understood the actual offer being extended, she'd assumed I'd read it as exactly what I'd taken it to be. Polite, generic, the standard things people said. "You didn't respond in a way that opened a door," Diane said. "I didn't know there was a door," I said. "I know," she said. "That's partly why I'm here." I thought about that text for a long stretch of road. Then I thought about the morning Viv had brought coffee out to the yard without explanation, setting it on the top rail of the fence between our properties while I was trying to fix something with the lawnmower. She'd just set it there and gone back inside. I'd said thank you to her retreating back, thought she'd made extra and didn't want to waste it, and gone back to what I was doing. It hadn't crossed my mind that someone who made extra coffee did not typically walk it outside and place it within reach of a specific person. I had been, in retrospect, spectacularly inattentive, and the strangest part of sitting with that realization was that I couldn't blame it on not caring. I cared fine. I simply cared in the wrong direction, inward, toward my own situation, my own marriage, my own slow unraveling, and missed the entire thing that was happening 6 feet away on the other side of a backyard fence. The reason she left for Portland, Diane said, wasn't the job. She had the opportunity for months before she took it. She took it because staying had become something she couldn't maintain. You were separated, then divorced, and she didn't want to be the thing that showed up right after. She didn't want to look like she'd been waiting. She was waiting, I said. She was waiting, Diane confirmed. But she didn't want you to know that. And she didn't want Rachel to think it either. So she left. And I think, if she's being honest with herself, she expected to eventually stop thinking about it, to let the distance do the work that time and willpower hadn't quite managed. Did it work? Diane looked out the passenger window at the dark yards sliding past. I don't know, she said. That's part of why I'm telling you this now. We drove another few miles without speaking. The radio was off. The only sounds were the road and the heater running low, and the occasional whoosh of a car passing the other direction. Eventually, Diane picked up the atlas again and turned it to the inside back page, where there was a map of the entire country, condensed and simplified, every state reduced to its outline and its major cities. She pulled a pen out of her coat pocket and wrote something in the bottom corner. Small, neat handwriting, the way she did everything. She set it back on the center console between us. Rachel got married last month, she said. You know that. I know. Which means I'm not protecting anything by not telling you this anymore. Everything has already settled into its new shape. The only thing left unsettled is what you do with what I just told you. She asked me to pull over in front of her house, which was coming up on the left. We'd been driving for about 45 minutes total. I hadn't tracked the route. I'd just driven wherever the road went, which was, I realized, exactly what she'd intended. Before she got out, she looked at the atlas one more time. He would have liked her, she said. She meant my father. She meant Viv. I don't know what I did with my face in that moment, but whatever it was, Diane nodded once, like it confirmed something she already suspected. She'd thought this through. Diane thought most things through. The rest is your decision, she said. I only drive so far. She closed the car door and walked up to her porch at a pace that suggested she was completely at peace with what she'd just done. And I sat there in the dark with the engine running, looking at the atlas on the passenger seat, at the address written in the bottom corner of the national map in Diane's small and neat handwriting, until I finally put the car in drive and went home. For 3 weeks after that, I did nothing. I kept the atlas on my kitchen table, which is not where I normally keep anything except coffee and whatever I'm currently reading. Every morning, I'd walk past it, sometimes pick it up, and look at the address Diane had written in the corner of the national map, and set it back down. I told myself I needed to think it through carefully. What I was actually doing was building a structured case for inaction. The reasons were not small reasons. Viv had been gone for 7 months. She had her own life in Portland now, her own routines, her own version of moving forward that I had played no part in constructing. I didn't know whether what Diane had witnessed 2 years ago still applied. People changed direction. Distance accelerated that. What right did I have to show up in someone's life based on a story a third party had told me about a moment they'd observed through a car window from 40 yards away, in the middle of a garden? These were real questions. I spent 3 full weeks with them, building the case for inaction, one reasonable concern at a time, which is a thing I am apparently very good at. I have a particular talent for finding the logical objection to the thing I actually want to do, dressing it up as prudence, and living inside that dressed-up version until something forces the question into the open again. Then I went to the grocery store on a Tuesday evening and ran into Rachel. She was in the produce section with her husband, and they were doing the kind of shopping you do when you've settled into a new domestic life. Not grabbing random things, but actually making choices together, discussing whether they needed more of something, disagreeing mildly about salad dressing. She looked well, genuinely well, the kind that comes from actually being well rather than performing it for an audience. We exchanged the sort of pleasantries that divorced people who don't hate each other exchange. And Kyle shook my hand and seemed like a reasonable person who was making Rachel happy, which made the interaction easier than it might otherwise have been. Before we parted, Rachel said something that she clearly intended as a passing comment. Casual, kind, no particular weight attached. You seeing anyone? You should try one of those apps. Pubs. Viv always said you'd never find anyone on your own because you don't know what you're looking for. She said it and moved on immediately, back to the salad dressing debate, back to her cart, back to the Tuesday evening of her life. I stood in the produce aisle for a moment with a bag of coffee in my hand. What Rachel had just told me, without realizing it, was that Viv had paid enough attention to me to form a specific and considered opinion about how I moved through the world. Not a general impression, not the casual assessment you form about someone you see occasionally at dinner parties. A specific, considered, observational conclusion about a pattern in my behavior that she'd identified over time. You don't arrive at the observation that someone doesn't know what they're looking for unless you've thought about them carefully, watched them long enough to see the pattern. And if you've seen the pattern, you've been paying close attention. Viv had told this to Rachel, which meant she'd talked about me in conversations when I wasn't in the room. If she'd done that while we were still neighbors, while I was still married to her best friend, she'd been thinking about me during a period when thinking about me was something she had every reason not to do. I drove home and sat in the parking garage of my apartment building for longer than I meant to, the engine off, looking at the atlas on the passenger seat where I'd left it that morning out of some habit I hadn't examined too carefully. The garage was nearly empty at that hour. Someone's car alarm tested itself briefly 3 floors up and then went quiet. I sat with it. That evening, Diane called. She didn't ask about Viv. She asked if I'd had dinner and whether the project I'd mentioned 3 weeks earlier had wrapped on schedule. We talked for about 15 minutes, nothing urgent. And near the end I said, without planning to say it, "What if I've turned this into something bigger than it is?" Diane didn't answer right away. "What if you have?" she finally said. "Then I've flown to Portland for no reason." "Then you'll come back knowing that," she said. "Which is better than what you have now, which is wondering." She paused. "Owen, you've been looking at that address for 3 weeks. Possibly you've been looking at Viv for considerably longer than that without knowing you were doing it. At some point, wondering has to become choosing because they feel similar from the inside, but they lead to entirely different places." I didn't book the flight that night. I ate dinner, watched whatever was on, went to bed at a reasonable hour. But before I slept, I had the airline website open on my phone, and I looked at the times and routes for a while before putting it down. And in the morning, I made the booking before I'd had a second cup of coffee. I didn't call Viv ahead of time. I didn't text. Not because I was trying to be dramatic about it, but because I genuinely couldn't figure out what I would have said over the phone that would have landed correctly. Some things need to be said in person, not because they're bigger that way, but because they're more honest. There's no edit button, no way to refine your phrasing until you sound like a slightly improved version of yourself. You just show up and say the thing with your actual face, and then you find out. The thought of doing this entire thing over a phone call and having it go badly, or go nothing, felt worse than the thought of flying somewhere on information I might have misread entirely. At least if I went and it turned out I'd made something out of nothing, I'd have been the one who made the mistake, not the one who kept wondering. Diane had told me that Viv usually worked from a coffee shop on Saturday mornings. She'd mentioned it casually, the kind of detail people accumulate when they stay in contact with someone, the texture of their ordinary week. I found the place online, figured out the neighborhood, and arrived at 9:15 on a Saturday morning with the atlas folded in my jacket pocket, feeling more or less like a person who had made a reasonable decision, even if the exact parameters of what I was hoping for were somewhat unclear. The shop was the kind of Portland coffee place that seemed designed specifically to make people feel like they'd made good decisions about their lives. High ceilings, enormous windows, the smell of good espresso, and something baking in the back kitchen. It was the kind of space that attracted people who brought laptops and stayed for hours. And on a Saturday morning in autumn, it was about 2/3 full. I stood at the entrance for a moment, scanning the room. Viv was at a corner table by the window, laptop open, headphones on, a half-finished coffee beside her. She looked the same and different in the specific way that people do when you've known them mostly in one context, and here they are in a completely different one. She looked like herself, but more settled, like Portland had agreed with her in a quiet way, like she'd found a version of her life that had more room in it. I walked over. She caught the movement in her peripheral vision when I was about 6 feet away. She looked up. She pulled her headphones off. Her expression did the thing expressions do when someone unexpected walks into your line of sight. Recalibration. Assessment. Something moving behind the eyes. "Owen? Hi." She sat back in her chair. "What are you doing here?" "Diane gave me an address," I said. "She wrote it in the atlas." Viv closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them, something had settled in them. She said, quietly, "Diane." I pulled the atlas out of my jacket pocket and set it on the table between us. I sat down across from her. She didn't object. We were both quiet for a moment, the noise of the coffee shop going on around us in that specific way that background sound does when you're trying to navigate something in the foreground. "She told me about the car," I said. "2 years ago. She said she saw you sitting in it. With this." I tapped the atlas. Viv looked at it. "How much did she tell you?" "Enough that I flew here without calling first." She picked up the atlas and turned it over in her hands. The same worn paper cover, the same fold crease running down the middle. She set it back down, flat between us. "I left," she said finally, "because staying didn't make sense. You were going through something real, and I didn't want to be a complication on top of what was already complicated. I didn't want to be the thing that showed up right after and looked like it had been waiting." "It was a long time ago," I said. 7 months, she said. 7 months since Portland. 14 months since the divorce was final. 2 years since you sat in my car and did whatever it was you did that Diane saw." She looked at the table for a moment. "She really just told you everything. She said she'd been holding it long enough. That is very Diane," Viv said. Then, after a pause, "What do you want me to say, Owen?" "I want you to say whatever's actually true," I said. "Not the version that's careful and doesn't create any problems, the one that's actually true." She was quiet for long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then, "When Rachel asked me to get something from your car, I went out and I found the atlas in the glove box. I knew it was your father's." Rachel had mentioned it once. I don't know why I opened it. I just sat there and I looked at it. And for some reason, that was the moment that everything I'd been not thinking landed on me all at once and I cried about it in someone else's car like an idiot, and apparently someone saw me. Diane? Diane, she confirmed. She looked at me steadily. I don't know what you want me to do with any of this now. I don't know either, I said. But I didn't fly to Portland to tell you I'd figured it all out. I came because I didn't want to spend the next year wondering if I should have. She looked at the atlas one more time. You want to get something to eat? I haven't eaten since the flight. There's a ramen place 2 blocks over, she said. It's actually good. Lead the way, I said. She closed her laptop. The walk to the ramen place took about 4 minutes, and we spent most of it not saying anything particularly significant. She mentioned that Portland got more rain than people expected, even knowing the reputation. I mentioned the project that had finally wrapped up after running 2 months past schedule. The kind of conversation that is about something else entirely. The kind that happens between 2 people who are figuring something out and using ordinary subjects as cover while their minds work on the real question. The ramen was genuinely excellent. We ate for a while without talking much, both of us doing the thing where you need a neutral activity to let the bigger conversation settle into something manageable. Then, gradually, we talked for about 2 hours over the food and the tea, and what struck me most was that it felt like the continuation of something, rather than the beginning, like picking up a thread that had been set down somewhere and waiting. She told me about the work she'd been doing in Portland, a sequence of brand identity projects for small Pacific Northwest companies who needed design help and couldn't afford the agencies, the kind of work she could do independently, on her own hours, without reporting to someone who'd undo everything she'd built in the final meeting. I told her about the Seattle satellite office my company had been discussing, which I'd been deliberately not thinking hard about because applying would be a decision, and I wasn't sure what I was deciding. She listened in the way that I now recognized as characteristic of her, not waiting for her turn, but actually tracking what was said, asking the follow-up that showed she'd caught the thing underneath the thing. When I mentioned the Seattle office, she said, "You've been not deciding about it for how long?" "About 4 months," I said. "That's a decision," she said. "Just a slow one." I didn't argue with that. That evening, I walked her back to her building, and we stood outside for a moment in the way you stand outside somewhere when neither person is quite ready to stop. She said, "I'm glad you came." I said, "So am I." And I meant it in the way you can only mean something when you're standing close to the version of yourself that almost didn't do the thing you're now glad you did. That other version who would have stayed in Indianapolis, decided he'd made too much of a second-hand story, and never found out. I changed my flight before I got back to the hotel. I stayed through Sunday evening. The contact after I returned to Indianapolis was not a formal anything. It was more like a door that had been pushed open and stayed that way. Texts in the evenings, phone calls that ran longer than planned. A rhythm that established itself gradually without either of us naming what it was. She would text about whatever she was working on, a color system that wasn't cooperating, a client who kept asking for opposing things simultaneously, a typeface she'd found that she was annoyed to love as much as she did. I'd text back with whatever was on my end, and the exchanges accumulated over weeks into something that felt like continuity, like picking up a thread that had been there all along, waiting to be picked up. I went back to Portland 5 weeks later, then again 6 weeks after that. The distance was real, and we didn't pretend it wasn't. The practical math of it required actual decisions, not the romantic pretense that love makes logistics irrelevant. 4 months in, I applied for the Seattle transfer. I didn't tell Viv until after I'd submitted the application, which turned out to be the right order to do it. She said, "You didn't have to do that for me." And I said I knew. and explained that the Seattle position was something I'd wanted for reasons that preceded her involvement in my thinking, which was true. It was also true that those independent reasons had never been sufficient motivation to act on before. People make the same available decision for different reasons at different times, and sometimes the new reason is someone who makes the old option suddenly feel worth it. The transfer came through in 2 weeks. I told Viv on a Tuesday phone call, and she said nothing for a moment, and then said, "When?" "8 weeks," I said. "Okay," she said. "That's it? Just okay?" "Owen," she said, and there was something in her voice that I recognized by then as the warmth she kept under the composure. "I've been watching you not decide things for 2 years. You decided something. I'm glad." 8 weeks later, I packed the apartment into a rental truck, made one last pass to make sure I hadn't left the Atlas. I hadn't. It was on the passenger seat of my car where it had lived for 6 years, and drove northwest. 6 months after the night Diane sat in my car, I was in Portland on a Saturday morning that had started with rain and cleared into something pale and clean by midday. Viv was at the table with her sketchpad, working through a logo revision that had been going back and forth with a client for longer than either of them wanted. I was on the couch with a site review document I was supposed to have finished by Monday, which I was not going to finish by Monday. Neither of us was talking. The apartment was quiet in the specific way it gets quiet when two people are comfortable working in the same room without needing to perform contentment. It's just there, in the background, not requiring attention, needing nothing from either of you except that you keep showing up. I looked up at some point and saw the Atlas. She'd put it in a frame and hung it on the shelf across from the window. She hadn't told me she was going to do that, and when I'd arrived the previous evening, I'd seen it and hadn't said anything yet. Just noted it the way you note things that need to be addressed properly when you have the right moment. "You framed it," I said. She didn't look up from the sketchpad. "It's where we started." I sat with that for a minute. I didn't have a response for it, not a real one. I just looked at the frame, the familiar worn cover of the Atlas, the crease down the middle, and in the bottom corner of the national map, Diane's handwriting. Small and neat. The address she'd written the night she sat in my passenger seat and said, "Just drive." I called Diane that afternoon from the small balcony, while Viv was still working inside. She picked up after 2 rings. "You okay?" she asked, which was how she answered her phone with me. Always a check-in before anything else, as though she expected at some point the answer might be no, and she wanted to have asked directly. "I'm in Portland," I said. A pause, then a quiet laugh. "I know. Viv texted me." "She texts you?" "We always talked," Diane said. "She didn't disappear when you and Rachel separated. She just stopped being visible to the parts of the picture you were looking at. We stayed in touch." I stayed on the balcony for a while after we hung up, looking out at the city. Clouds moving in from the coast the way they did this time of year, steady and inevitable, darkening the sky from the west in a way that didn't feel threatening so much as just settled, like weather that knew exactly what it was doing. The particular quality of Pacific Northwest light in the afternoon, gray and soft and clean. I'd grown up in Indiana, where October had a sharper character, cleaner edges, more abrupt. This was something I was still adjusting to, and finding, mostly, that I didn't mind the adjustment. I thought about the drive, the Indianapolis streets, the Atlas on Diane's lap, the yellow streetlights pacing us through the suburbs, her voice in the dark, measured and careful, saying the things she'd been carrying for 2 years. And I thought about how close I'd come to standing in my apartment 3 weeks later, looking at that address on the kitchen table, and deciding it wasn't enough of a reason to do anything. The thing I keep coming back to when I think about all of it, and I think about it more than I would have expected, is that none of it was dramatic. Not in the way that stories about love are supposed to be. Diane didn't sweep into my life with a revelation. She drove around Indianapolis for 45 minutes and told me what she'd observed through a car window, and then she went home. Viv didn't run toward me at the coffee shop. She took her headphones off and asked what I was doing in Portland. I didn't declare anything. I changed a flight home and went to get ramen. The whole thing was ordinary. And the ordinariness of it is the part I wouldn't change. I used to think significant things were supposed to feel significant in the moment they were happening, that you'd feel the weight of them arrive and know. I don't think that anymore. I think most of the things that matter most show up looking like nothing in particular, and you only understand later what you were standing inside. Some people see you clearly. Not the version you put together for other people, not the version that's adapted for whatever the room seems to need from you, but the actual configuration of who you are, what you genuinely pay attention to when nothing is being asked of you, what you return to, what stays with you without you having to work at it. That kind of seeing is rarer than it sounds. Most people, including the people who love you, are looking at a version of you that's been shaped by their own needs and expectations. Diane looked at me across the table at holiday meals and saw something different from what Rachel saw across the same table. I don't think Diane loved me more. I think she just had no particular investment in who she needed me to be. Diane saw something in me that I had entirely missed in myself, and she saw the same thing in Viv. Something real and specific, visible for a moment through a car window in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. She held on to both of those observations for 2 years, waiting for a time when they might be useful. Then she used a spare key, sat in my passenger seat, and said, "Just drive." The atlas is framed on the shelf. There's an address in the corner in handwriting you'd have to lean in to read. Small and deliberate, put there at the end of a 45-minute drive by a woman who had been waiting for the right moment for 2 years. Every time I look at it, I see the whole drive. The dark road, the heater running low, the suburban streets of Indianapolis sliding past the windows, her voice from the passenger seat saying, "The rest is your decision." She was right. It was mine to make. I'm glad I finally made it, and glad that someone with better instincts than mine gave me the necessary push. So here's the question I've been sitting with for 6 months now. Have you ever had someone in your life who could see you more clearly than the people you were actually closest to? Someone at the edge of the frame who had the full picture while you were only looking at your part of it? And if someone got into your car at midnight and said, "Just drive," would you? If this story reached something for you, say it in the comments. I want to know. Like this video if you believe the person who changes your direction isn't always who you expected. And subscribe. Because next week, I have another story about ordinary people and the quiet decisions that end up mattering more than anyone planned for.